She walked up to me at my own sister's bridal shower, in my mother's living room, with the floral centerpieces I'd spent 2 weekends making, and said, loud enough for the women nearest to us to hear, I always knew you weren't good enough for him. Turns out I was right. I was holding a glass of lemonade. I didn't put it down. I didn't say a word. 5 minutes later, the front door opened. My name is Tessa Harmon, and I'm 34 years old. I'm a corporate tax attorney at a mid-sized firm in Philadelphia, which means I spend most of my days in depositions and document reviews and conference calls that run 30 minutes past when they should have ended. It's not glamorous work. It doesn't come with a white coat or a title that makes people at parties lean forward with interest. What it comes with is an understanding of financial structures that most people spend their whole lives never needing to have. And as it turned out, an accidental front row seat to the kind of collapse that takes years to build and about 45 seconds to announce. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 14 months ago, I signed divorce papers in a conference room on the 22nd floor of a building downtown. Across a table from a man I'd spent 7 years of my life building something with. And I drove home afterward and sat in the parking garage of my apartment complex for probably 20 minutes before I felt ready to go inside. Not because I was devastated. Not because I regretted it. More because I'd expected to feel something definitive. Grief or relief or the clean snap of a door closing. And instead I just felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. His name is Garrett Aldridge. We met when I was 26 and he was 31, at a work event neither of us wanted to be at. And for the first 2 years, things were good in the way that things are good when you're still young enough to mistake momentum for connection. We got engaged, we got married. We bought a house in Chestnut Hill with original hardwood floors and a kitchen that needed updating and a backyard we never used enough. His mother's name is Roberta. Roberta Aldridge has been refining the art of polite cruelty for approximately 68 years, and she has gotten very, very good at it. The smile that arrives just before the comment. The concern that is shaped exactly like an insult. The way she could say, I just worry about you, and make it feel like a verdict. I spent 7 years trying to find the version of myself that would satisfy her, and what I eventually understood, sitting in a therapist's office in the second year of couples counseling, was that no such version existed. I wasn't the problem she was solving. I was the variable she'd decided, before she ever really knew me, didn't belong in the equation. We divorced because of a lot of things. Garrett's long absences, the travel that kept extending, the emotional distance that became so familiar I almost stopped noticing it until I did. And then I noticed it constantly. And then I noticed the credit card statements. And then I found out about Brooke. Brooke was my coworker. Not my closest friend. We weren't roommates in college. We didn't have years of history. But we'd had lunch together at least once a week for 3 years. We'd covered for each other on days when one of us needed to leave early. I'd recommended her for a position on a case that got her promoted. I thought I knew who she was. I thought wrong. The baby was born 7 weeks after Garrett and I finalized our divorce. A girl. I found out from someone else at the firm, delivered as an awkward condolence, and I remember thinking, the math on that is interesting. And then I remember thinking about nothing at all, which is sometimes how I handle the things they're too large to process immediately. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Rittenhouse Square. I took on more cases. I started running in the mornings, which I had never done before, and it turned out to be the kind of thing that gives you somewhere to put all the thoughts you can't afford to have during the day. I wasn't okay right away. I want to be honest about that. There were nights that were harder than others, and there was a period around the holidays where I did not feel particularly steady. But I kept going to work. I kept doing my job. And slowly, without my noticing it happening, I started to feel like myself again. Not the version of myself I'd been in that marriage, but something cleaner. Something mine. By the following spring, I had a good life. Not a perfect life, not a finished life, but one that felt like it was actually moving in a direction I'd chosen. And then my sister announced her engagement. Lauren is 31 and marrying a man named Patrick, who is, genuinely, one of the better human beings I've encountered in my adult life. When she told me she wanted to have her bridal shower at our mom's house in Bryn Mawr, I said yes before she finished the sentence. I spent 2 weekends helping our mother clear out the sunroom, string lights across the back porch, and assemble the kind of floral arrangements from the farmer's market that are slightly imperfect in the way that means they look intentional. I made a spreadsheet for the RSVPs because I am a tax attorney and I make spreadsheets for things. I did not think about Roberta once during any of this preparation. That was a mistake. What I did not know until the morning of the shower was that one of Lauren's college friends from Penn had married a man whose mother played tennis with Roberta Aldridge, which meant that Roberta's name appeared on the guest list, which meant that Lauren, who has a generous and somewhat idealistic view of social situations, had assumed this would be fine. It was not immediately fine. I was in the kitchen helping my mom transfer food from containers to serving platters when she came in through the front door with the rest of the guests. I heard her laugh, that particular laugh, the one she produced for audiences, before I saw her. I kept transferring food. I told myself it was a party and I was an adult, and there were 40 other people in this house, and none of this needed to mean anything. I walked out to the sunroom with a platter of food, and she found me within approximately 4 minutes. Tessa. She said my name like she was identifying something she'd stepped in. I didn't realize you'd be here. It's my sister's shower, I said. At my mother's house. Something flickered across her face. Not embarrassment, Roberta doesn't do embarrassment, more like a recalibration. She was wearing a silk blouse the color of a winter sky and earrings that probably cost more than my first car, and she held her mimosa glass with the particular grip of a woman who has decided she is the most important person in any room she enters. Well, she said, and the smile arrived, the one I recognized from 100 Sunday dinners. I suppose these things happen. I set the platter down on the table. I picked up my lemonade from where I'd left it earlier. I was perfectly calm. I've spent years learning to be perfectly calm when I don't want to be. She waited until a small cluster of women drifted closer, Lauren's friends, women I'd known peripherally for years, and then she spoke at exactly the volume she always chose, loud enough to be heard, soft enough to pretend it was private. I always knew you weren't good enough for him, she said. Turns out, I was right. A small, satisfied pause. He has a daughter now, a real family, everything you couldn't give him. I want to tell you I had a response ready. Something precise and devastating that I'd been saving. But that's not what happened. What happened was that I looked at her, at the 68-year-old woman who had spent 7 years making me feel like a guest in my own marriage. And I felt something very quiet and very settled inside my chest. And I said, "Is that so?" Not a question. Not even sharp. Just 2 words that landed flat and left her with nothing to push against. Her smile held for a moment, then adjusted. She'd expected something she could use, tears, or anger, or a shaking voice, and I hadn't given her any of it. She opened her mouth to try again. He chose her, she pressed. At the end of the day, that's what matters. He chose someone who could actually. The front door opened. I heard it from the sunroom, which is at the back of the house, which means it was loud enough to register through 2 rooms and 20 people's conversations. And then I heard my mother's voice, doing the particular thing it does when she's greeting someone she's genuinely pleased to see. And then footsteps in the hallway, unhurried, the kind that belong to someone who moves through spaces without needing to announce themselves. He appeared in the doorway of the sunroom, scanning the room once the way people do when they're looking for a specific face. And when he found mine, something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically. Just the small softening of a person who has found what they were looking for. His name is Owen Mercer. He's 40 years old, and he runs the Restructuring and Distressed Assets Division at a private equity firm headquartered in Center City. We met 8 months ago through a mutual colleague, at a dinner I almost canceled because I was tired, and it had been a long week, and I am so profoundly grateful that I didn't cancel it. He has dark hair going slightly silver at the temples, and the kind of quiet confidence that doesn't need a room to notice it. He'd been at his firm's quarterly review when I left that morning, and he'd texted to say he'd try to make it by noon. It was 12:07. He crossed the sunroom toward me, and I watched Roberta's head turn. Slowly at first, then sharply, in the way it does when the brain takes a moment to catch up to the eyes. "Sorry I'm late," Owen said, his hand finding the back of my arm in the easy, uncalculated way of someone who's done it 100 times before. Parker wouldn't stop talking about the Northeastern deal. I think he's genuinely in love with this acquisition. "You're not late," I said. "You're exactly on time." Something in my voice must have carried more than I intended, because he glanced past me and his gaze landed on Roberta, taking in the frozen mimosa glass, the carefully composed expression that was now composing considerably less carefully. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said, and I heard the recognition in his voice, the particular recognition of someone who knows the name professionally, not personally. "I didn't expect to see you here." Roberta's mouth opened, closed. She looked at him the way you look at something that doesn't fit the category you've put it in. You two know each other? She asked, and there was something different in her voice now, not the smooth confidence of a woman delivering a performance, but the thinner register of one who has suddenly lost the thread of the script. We're engaged, I said, simply. No drama, no emphasis. Just the fact, set down between us like something that had been true for a while, because it had. I watched her try to absorb it. Watched her look at Owen, really look at him, the tailored jacket, the ease in his posture, the way he stood close to me without making it performative, and I could see her revising the image she'd built of me over the past 14 months. The divorced woman who couldn't give her son what he needed. The woman who'd been replaced. The cautionary tale she'd apparently been sharing, in various forms, with anyone who'd listen over Sunday brunch. But it wasn't the engagement that made her color change. It was what Owen said next. He said it the way he says most things. Quietly, matter-of-factly. The way someone speaks when they're simply reporting information rather than deploying it as a weapon. He'd pulled out his phone briefly to check a message and was putting it back in his jacket pocket as he spoke. I've been meaning to tell you, the Aldridge Holdings situation came to a head this morning. The SEC filing triggered the review we've been waiting on. Our fund holds the senior debt on the commercial real estate portfolio, and based on what came through this morning, we're moving to accelerate the maturity. The underlying assets aren't performing anywhere close to what the loan covenants required. A small pause, the kind that comes from reading a face rather than a text message. I didn't realize you'd have a personal connection to that account. Roberta went very still. Aldridge Holdings, she repeated. The words came out in a voice I had never heard from her before, stripped of all the performance, small and careful, like she was testing whether they were real. That's my husband's company. Garrett manages the commercial division. Owen looked at her with something that was genuinely kind, because that's who he is, even in moments like this. I know. I recognized the name when the file came across my desk 6 weeks ago, and I recused myself from the decision-making given the personal connection. But the decision was made above me this morning. Our legal team will be reaching out before the end of the business day. The position isn't recoverable at current valuations, which means the restructuring process starts now. The sunroom around us kept moving. Someone was laughing on the back porch. The string lights I'd hung 2 weekends ago swayed slightly in the breeze coming through the screen door. Lauren was across the room opening a gift and didn't know any of this was happening. Roberta's composure, which I had watched hold for 7 years across every family dinner and every barbed comment and every performance of loving concern, did not shatter. It didn't shatter because Roberta is not a person who allows herself to shatter in public. But it cracked. Around the edges of her eyes, in the slight tremor of the hand holding the mimosa glass, in the way her shoulders came down by maybe half an inch and never quite recovered. There must be a mistake, she said. Her voice was very even. Garrett is careful. He always has been. I'm sure this is a lot to take in, Owen said. I'm sorry you're hearing it here. She didn't answer. She looked at the glass in her hand as though she'd forgotten how it got there. Then she set it down on the edge of the nearest table with a small, precise click. The most controlled thing she did in those 30 seconds. And she said, "Please excuse me," to no one in particular, and walked out of the sunroom through the hallway toward the front of the house. I heard the door open. I heard it close. I thought about Garrett. I thought about the commercial real estate portfolio he'd mentioned. Vaguely and enthusiastically, at a dinner we'd had maybe 3 years into our marriage. How it was going to be the thing that made everything else possible, how his father had built it from nothing, and he was going to take it further. I thought about Brooke, and the baby girl, and the apartment they'd moved into in Haverford, and what the next few months would look like for them, once the calls from lawyers started coming, and the credit lines got complicated. I didn't feel triumphant. I've thought about that a lot since. Why I didn't. I'd spent months in the raw and unguarded hours, imagining some version of this. Not this exactly, not Roberta specifically, but the general shape of it. The moment when someone who had worked hard to make me feel small got to see what I'd built in the time they assumed I was falling apart. I thought it would feel like winning, like a door slamming on the way out. It didn't feel like any of those things. What it felt like was this. The last of something very heavy that I hadn't realized I was still carrying finally just set itself down. Not with a crash. More like when you've had a tense muscle so long that you stop registering the tension, and then one day it releases, and you realize only in the release how much energy you'd been spending just to hold that weight. Owen turned to me when she'd gone, and for a moment he just looked at my face the way he does sometimes when he's reading me more carefully than I'm reading myself. "You okay?" he said. "Yeah," I said. And then, "Actually, yes, I really am." He didn't push it. He just nodded, once, and his hand found mine, and we stood there for a moment while my sister laughed at something across the room, and the lights held on in the afternoon, and the party went on being exactly what it was supposed to be. I've thought about what Roberta said to me, the line she'd clearly spent time polishing, the one about a real family, everything you couldn't give him, and what I keep coming back to is how small it sounds now. Not because what she was describing wasn't painful. It was. The whole situation was painful in ways I'll probably still be unpacking for years. But the size of what she was saying, what she wanted it to do to me, that part seems small. The idea that my worth could be measured by what Garrett chose, or didn't choose. The idea that a woman who gathers other people's failures like collectibles is somehow the arbiter of what constitutes a real life. I'm 34 years old. I'm a tax attorney in Philadelphia. I'm engaged to a man who texted me at 7 a.m. to ask if I needed anything for the shower, and then showed up at 12:07, carrying a card with a handwritten note inside that made me have to excuse myself to the bathroom for 2 minutes because I didn't want to cry in front of 40 people. I don't have a perfect life. I have a life I built, deliberately, from the material that was left after something fell apart. And it turns out that what you build on the other side of a hard thing can be more solid than what you had before. Because you chose every piece of it with the awareness of what the alternative looked like. Roberta wanted to show me what I'd lost. What she couldn't have known, what I'm not sure she'll ever understand, is that the things she was describing as losses were the very things that led me here. The divorce that leveled me also freed me. The betrayal that broke the last of my trust in that version of my life also broke my attachment to it. And in the space that opened up, I found something that fits in a way that marriage never quite did. Quietly, without fanfare, the way things feel when they're actually right rather than just chosen. She walked out my mother's front door believing she'd done something to me. She left before she could see me laughing on the back porch with my sister an hour later, in the afternoon sun, lemonade in hand, planning a wedding I'm actually excited about. I don't need her to know that. I don't need her to understand it, or correct her assumptions, or carry back any version of the truth to anyone who'd been enjoying the other version. I used to want that. The acknowledgement, the record set straight. I've stopped wanting it. The best thing that ever happened to Roberta Aldridge's opinion of me was that I stopped needing her to change it. And I walked back into that party, back to my sister, back to the afternoon I'd spent 2 weekends building, and I didn't think about her again for the rest of the day.